and there's not just Mark's research about CCS and its efficiency, or rather lack of efficiency, in actually sucking the carbon out of fossil fuel production, among other things. And it's actually really quite expensive. Why can't we reduce our energy, which is one of the first things we should be doing, and rather than speak up what we currently at as what we want to get at, and actually have the policies and action plans in place to get there, and without really, what I'm hearing from the other two speakers, really dominating our energy discussions on using the CCS. Really, is it effective and efficient enough? And why would we use that when there's better ways?
Well, I'll try to answer. Yeah, I think the CCS is pushed a lot by the fossil fuel companies. I mean, we find in our own research that the only type of carbon removal is like reducing deforestation, increasing reforestation that's necessary. And actually, another group has found this as well. Sven Teske and his group, they've done global simulations, and we've done global simulations where we look at just going to 100% renewables and then also reducing non-energy emissions. And because of natural removal processes of CO2, by 2100, we can get to 350 parts per million without any artificial carbon removal. The problem with carbon removal is that it's designed not to do anything else. It's designed not to reduce air pollution. It's designed not to reduce mining of fuels or any of the other fossil fuel infrastructure. So it'll never do that. No matter how good or cheap you make it, it'll never solve those other problems. And unless you use renewables for it, then it'll always increase air pollution. So it'll always make social costs worse. And if you use renewables, that's always worse than using the renewables for something else. So there's really no case I can see ever for using carbon capture. Even when you eliminate all fossil fuels, then it becomes a question, why not just reduce biomass burning, reduce halogens? Why isn't there effort to reduce methane from the air, or methane from digesters, or rice paddies, or nitrous oxide from fertilizer? These are all easier methods than taking carbon out of the air. It just seems like if you just want to try everything, fine, but we don't have enough money to do that. That's the problem.
Okay, so is the etiquette you just sort of blast in here when you're ready, Alison? So I don't wait to be asked. I'll just blast in then. So I agree with Mark that getting to renewables is a good endpoint, and whether it's renewables plus or minus nuclear remains to be seen, because I'm still optimistic that several smart physicists will produce fusion power towards the end of my lifetime, but not right at the end of my lifetime. So we can produce energy in different ways, but because we're so invested in this complexity of 250 years worth of fossil fuel use, it's taking us a long time to navigate out of that. So we've known all this since the 1990s, and we've known about climate change being driven by carbon dioxide since the 1800s, but very few people have done anything about it. So it's the inertia in the political system which is the problem. And of course, that is fed by lobby groups for people who make money out of the existing system, and that's their job, I suppose. They like to make money that way. But I still think that we know we can use efficiency. We know we can do that. We could. Amory Lovins showed that in the Rocky Mountain Institute way back in the 1970s. He said he could run his house on half the amount of electricity or half the amount of power, and everybody said he was crazy, but then he went and did it. And he's now said he can run his house on maybe a quarter or a fifth of the amount of 1970s power, and people have told him he's crazy, but he's still going to go ahead and do that. So we could all do that on our houses. You know, the UK's got terrible housing stock, but none of us has bolted insulation onto the outside of our house for insulation and fuel efficiency purposes, because it costs us a lot of money, it takes a lot of time, and it doesn't actually save much. So I think we're stuck with a complex system which needs multiple complex actions. And so I've briefly alluded to one of the actions the UK managed to do, has managed to, quite successfully mostly get out of coal. And so the situation in North America is rather different to the situation we've got in the UK and in much of Europe, in that we've now the slogan was powering past coal. So we have gotten a lot of the way out of coal. So the baseline has shifted. You know, now methane gas was seen as a transition fuel. Now it's quite rightly seen as the next target for getting rid of carbon emissions. So stepwise, you'll get there, but it's going to take a long journey, I think.
And if I can step in here, maybe. I agree that, you know, there's no such thing actually as zero carbon energy, because, you know, even wind power, you have to make the wind turbines, you have to have land use change when you install them. You know, electric transport, it's, you know, having a car that's run by electricity, you know, it concatenates down the line that basically you need more electricity. If you decarbonize your house by going to electricity, you need more electricity. So that's more stuff, more equipment. So it's not zero carbon. I think that's the first thing. The second thing is, we also have this quandary of the, you know, the United Nations goals, Millennium Goals, you know, and development goals, and basically trying to get the entire globe, if you like, equaled up rather than equaled down. And so, you know, there's an ambition in other countries. I mean, it's easy to sit in the UK and say, okay, we've reduced our coal emissions because we've got gas and we've done that. And now we're going to get electric cars and we're going to put up wind turbines. But, you know, there's a limit to the space, and we cannot go really that far. There's not enough land in the UK to offset using forests or bioenergy CCS at all. So you can't use land-based stuff. It's very difficult to level up the world, feed a growing population, and to meet the aspirations of shall we say, increased life chances for everybody in Africa and China and India. And although, for example, you know, China has said it's going to go to net zero, I really question how, because they're still building a bunch of coal-fired power stations. I can't remember how many. It's more than 10 a year, and in addition, their energy use is going up. They're buying electric cars, but they're running them on coal, because basically they're generating the electricity to power the cars, and they're running it on coal power. So it's not a virtual circle. What it does do is it gets rid of the social aspect of pollution in the cities, as long as you put the coal-fired power stations outside. So I think I'll use Tesco's mantra that every little helps. I mean, we've got to decarbonize everything we can, but in the end, you know, there is a certain amount of price that everybody's going to have to pay if you're going to level up, because, you know, all of the renewable power is expensive, actually, more expensive than gas at the moment. You also need storage.
Ashley, I'm going to cut across you there, if
Yeah.
you don't mind.
Okay, fine, but then you get the message.
We have a number of other questioners lined up. Thank you very much. I'm going to move on to David Fisher, who's also asking about the efficiency of the CCS process.
Honestly, I'd rather hear what Mark has to say in response to what Stuart and Ashley just said, if he's got a response, but I'll ask my question if that structure is preferred.
Well, why don't you ask your question, and we will let battle commence.
All right, fine. Yeah, so just, I guess we know, like, plants achieve very, very efficient carbon capture. So I was wondering, what prospects do humanity have of getting there, like increasing the efficiency? Stuart has his hand up, I think. I'm not sure if that's...
I was just adjusting my light.
All
Sorry.
right, fine. Yeah, so
anyway.
I'm wondering if your data is many projections are based on a stationary efficiency, and if there is any prospect of increasing efficiency and making CCS viable at all.
Well, I think with all this conversation, you've got to decide what you're really after, so that CCS may be very, you know, or none of these uses of fossil fuel which we've invented for ourselves are very efficient at all. You know, so the classical thing might be, I think it's about, of the petrol you put into your car, you use about 20% of the energy actually moving your car around. The other 80% is wasted in extraction, transport, refining, and getting it there. So we're phenomenally inefficient. So there are huge scopes for efficiency gains in lots of things. Turning to your particular question on carbon capture, on the carbon capture step, then the chemical engineers can capture 80% of the carbon, 90% of the carbon, or 99% of the carbon dioxide emitted. It just depends if you want to pay the relevant amount of money for the solvent and the processes. So you can be very efficient at capturing the CO2, but a lot of Mark's analysis, as I understood it, was including, quite correctly, including in the whole life cycle, what carbon cost is there in extracting coal, in processing coal, in transporting coal, what social costs are there in the particulate emissions and the radioactive particles going up the chimney when you burn the coal. All of those things don't often get fully included, and that's why I'm saying I'm a big fan of what I might call a full life cycle analysis from cradle to grave, when you truly expose the inefficiency and the other factors which are involved in getting that small piece of useful electricity which you're after. But I will say that if you do fit, I'm sure, I think I probably do disagree, but if you do fit carbon capture and storage onto a coal-fueled power plant, then the actual emissions from the plant must have less particulates and must have less other damaging material, let's say, coming out, because you've sent that through a scrubber, basically. So
Can I ask, will any of the three presenters answer the question about the efficiency of carbon capture? We've heard 99% is feasible. Is that practical? How much does it cost to remove vast amounts of carbon from industrial processes?
Yeah, so I was hoping Mark would answer, and I was also efficiency in terms of energy per carbon dioxide, rather than like just how much of the carbon dioxide can we capture.
Well, I mean, I'm no expert on what can be captured, but I'll just say that it was expected that the Texas Parish plant would capture 90%, 85 to 90%, but in reality, it captured 56%. And it was shut down. I mean, it was started in 2017. It was closed in 2020 because it was so inefficient. And they spent $1 billion on it. And basically, you know, it's just a tax on poor people. I mean, you're basically, who pays the highest fraction of their electricity from highest fraction of their energy, or sorry, of their income for electricity? It's people who have the least amount of money. So basically, ratepayers are going to be paying this money. And this, yeah, the efficiency is less, in reality, is less than what's proposed. And then when you account, and it also ignores the actual fact that you don't capture any of the upstream emissions, not only of the coal, but also of the, let's say you use a gas plant, you don't capture any of that, or the gas plant emissions themselves. This is the real problem.
I'm going to I mean, I agree that you need to include those upstream emissions, but because we didn't really have time to talk about it, then the upstream emissions, which Mark, I think you were suggesting from your gas fuel power plants, the upstream emissions seemed incredibly large to me. And that may be true in North America, where you have super leakers, but in Europe, then it's very unusual to get more than 1 or 2% leakage of methane from extraction through to use, because there's so much regulation on that.
Well, let me comment on that. So I would agree if you're talking about conventional gas, but like in the US, it's like 60% of all gas is fracked gas, and the leakage rates are there 3 to 4%.
Yeah, so that's a really daft thing to do, is frack for gas.
Yeah, well, that's what's going on. That's the reality right now.
I think, just to add something on the cost, I mean, I think, you know, there's an efficiency. There's also a learning curve for any new technology. And I think if you start with the first one, it's going to be inefficient and expensive. But when you get to the nth example of it, it's going to be a lot less. I mean, if you just take wind turbines, for example, the first wind turbines are very expensive, but now they're I'm not cheap as chips, but they are a lot less. If you take the efficiency of automobiles, you know, they started out being about 10% efficient. Now they're 20, 21, 22. So it's and they're cheaper as well. So, you know,
I'll grant that they will get more efficient, but the problem is it doesn't address air pollution. It doesn't address the mining. It doesn't address the infrastructure. It's not intended to. And I know if you're just looking at CO2, you know, you can make a case for it, but I don't look at CO2 only. I look at 7 million people die from air pollution worldwide each year. And this will just go up with carbon capture. And you're taking money away from all the other techniques that are going to be cheaper from a social cost perspective. We can't look at things from just a direct cost perspective. Everything has to be looked at from a social cost perspective. So unless you're accounting for climate costs, air pollution costs, and energy costs, it's not a correct analysis. There's no, you can't just look at the business cost and say that's, oh, it's based on business costs, we can do this. We have to look at the social costs. That's the proper way to analyze these things.
I agree, Mark. And I think, you know, obviously, you know, CCS is not a panacea or an excuse not to decarbonize energy systems or other things. It's the last resort, I would say. And being pragmatic, we need a last resort right now because we're not doing it fast enough. And I think that's probably the bottom line of this.
Well,
lastly, gentlemen, we'll move on. Thank you. We've got a question from Eric, initially for Stuart, but the others can join in. Eric, go ahead.
Yeah, I think I'm probably the subject of the statement earlier about a number of people hogging the chat with their questions. So I'll try to fit a few together on a little bit of a sidestep, because I've seen from the various speakers, I've seen quite a bit of information, very one-sided information come past on CCS, which has been bugging me immensely as someone who knows quite a bit about CCS, but it's too difficult to do that, and I'm not a panel member, so I'll leave that to the panel members to find out. One of the things I see is that there seems to be, particularly from Stuart, but also to some extent from Astley, seems to be focused on using CCS for whatever you can, including for direct air capture. If I look at the, there's quite a lot of study work that's going on. The EU does.
Eric, can we move to your question, please?
Yeah, what I'm looking at, should CCS really be this panacea for everything? As in, should we try to capture all the CO2 emissions that we produce now? Or should we pay a little bit more attention perhaps to what is required for transforming the emissions of heavy industry, which is to some extent hydrogen, and reserve some of the infrastructure which we'll need for hydrogen storage, which is necessary for actually going to net zero, because CCS will never make it to net zero. So it's about the infrastructure. And as far as I'm concerned, I'd like to hear the opinion of all the speakers on that.
So, gentlemen, if you can unpick the threads from that question, please go ahead.
Well, I think the short answer is yes. You need to do that. You need to do everything. You know, you need to. I mean, to decarbonize, it's a massive change to the way we live our lives and what we do, and we have to decarbonize. You know, the trouble is, you have to decarbonize what you can, and heavy industry hasn't been done yet, and it needs to be done. So yes, you need to have these resources for hydrogen and everything else as well.
So I'll answer that. Well, we need 80% transition by 2030 and 100% as soon as possible after that. And it costs so much and we have to do so much. We cannot just do everything. We can't, this all of the above is doesn't work policy. We need to focus on what works and what is most effective. And when we're spending, you know, billions of dollars on a technology that all it does is reduce carbon. I mean, carbon dioxide is only 45% of global warming. 55% of warming is due to all the other chemicals. Like black carbon is the second leading cause of warming. Methane, nitrous oxide, halogens are 10% of warming. And ozone is part of it from air pollution. When we focus on just removing carbon dioxide and spending billions on it, when it takes years to put up a plant for the most, and like the Texas Parish plant took many years to put it up, and then it was so inefficient, it closed down after a few years, and it was a test plant. even with more new technologies, you just can't put up enough at low enough cost in any short period of time. Whereas we are effectively eliminating emissions by getting rid of coal plants, transitioning to wind and solar and some geothermal, some hydropower, but and storage is coming down. Things that are low cost are what we need to focus on. Things that we can deploy rapidly or low cost. Things that are expensive and that hardly do anything really should not be. We should move away from those, and because of the short period of time we have. In terms of industry itself, the same conclusions that I found for a coal plant, they apply for industry. I mean, first of all, in steel, you can do a hydrogen process that has no CO2 emissions. So you can do, there are processes for several industrial processes that don't result in CO2 emissions, process emissions. All energy in industry, you can use electricity for that, but the process emissions, instead of capturing that carbon, in some cases, you can use different technologies that have no carbon emissions. In other cases, it's better to actually allow that carbon, like cement. It may be better to allow that CO2 to be emitted and then use that money to try to get rid of coal, gas, oil, go to electric vehicles. Just so many more much more low-hanging fruit than just reducing CO2 from industry.
So
Okay.
A lot of this then relies on the thought that near to zero carbon electricity is the holy grail, which we can just roll out. But I say again, that's going to take longer than you think, because the UK has been doing that for about 15 to 20 years, and we've got halfway through our electricity system. So if you want to do the other 80% of energy use, then it's going to take you another 40 or 50 years to build the relevant number of windmills and connect them, because we're currently building plenty of windmills onshore and offshore which are not connected adequately to the grid. So you can build, and the pricing structure in the UK mitigates against building wind power around in Scotland and around the north of Scotland, because it costs you money to ship that electricity down to England. So the whole system of trying to decarbonize the electricity system is not well joined up. And then I go to the fact that we do have a very seasonal climate in the UK, and we have terrible housing in terms of energy efficiency. And that's why we have much greater energy use in the winter than we do in the summer. So if you go to electricity, you have to either you turn people's heating off in the winter when they want it in the morning, or you have to find ways of storing energy to produce lots of energy when it's needed for periods of time when we know that there's very low wind generation for a week at a time. So these are very difficult problems to solve of reliability. And at the moment we're solving them by paying the extra carbon cost by not fully transitioning. So carbon is one thing. Carbon dioxide is one thing, reliability is another thing, and resilience, and also cost at the end of the day. But I'll argue that unless we focus on at least trying to solve the carbon dioxide problem and getting a long way through with the carbon dioxide problem, then there is no second chance, because we know that the world has had lots of carbon dioxide rapidly released into its atmosphere multiple times before. And each time that happens are really extremely adverse consequences for the life which happens to be living on the land. So we're busy doing that experiment, and you can argue a little bit about whether it's the cost or not the cost, but actually for many of the people in the UK, the cost of fully decarbonising is the price of a restaurant meal for a family per year, and that's an easily affordable cost.
Well, I'm going to disagree. First of all, UK has a policy that I think they're putting heat pumps for homes are going to be put in by the millions. I think Boris Johnson has a new policy to go for heat pumps, and heat pumps use 1/4 the energy as gas heaters. So you don't have the seasonal problem because you're using so much less electricity than you are gas in the winter.
No,
we've simulated the UK transitioning 100% UK for all energy sectors, and you can keep the grid stable at much lower cost than a fossil fuel system. You're using much less energy. When you go to electric vehicles, heat pumps, it's like 50 to 60% less energy, end use energy, and you have less seasonal variation of that energy because of the efficiency of these technologies. And there's plenty of wind and also solar in the UK to do this. It's really just a question of policy. Sure, if you just let things go as they are, then it'll take a long time. But if you actually have strong policies, it'll transition. But what you're saying is let's spend money instead on something that's more expensive, that has less social cost benefit, instead of spending it on the heat pumps, instead of spending on electric vehicles. We should spend on carbon capture, which turns out to not do anything. There's no proof that you actually capture any carbon. So well, you don't even know you're capturing carbon.
Not at all. I'm saying we should spend more money on lots of extra energy efficiency methods, and also we also have to pay attention not just to the total amount of energy, because I agree with you, of course, that electric cars are overall more efficient, and I agree with you that heat pumps can produce heat when needed, but the problem is that the overall demand when that's needed is not uniformly spread throughout the year. So the maximum use of a heat pump is in the cold weather in the winter. Okay, so the wires going along the street have not been capable are not capable of supplying that amount of electricity, because at the moment the wires along the street supply people's lights. All their heating energy is supplied by a pipe transporting methane. So you have to transfer from the methane energy supply to the electricity energy supply. So there's a huge infrastructure change which is needed, and that's going to take decades.
In addition, it needs quite a lot of storage, because in the dark winter, midwinter, when the wind isn't blowing and you have a frosty morning and no sun, you need something else other than wind and solar.
Yeah. And we know what the storage demand is. So I showed you that expressed as gas usage. But again, we are orders of magnitude away from having that amount of storage if we rely on an electricity system.
Yeah, well, as I said, not only have we simulated the UK, but others have simulated it too at 100% renewables. And it's not the problem you're saying in terms of the storage. And I agree
so
that
on average during the year, you're quite correct, but it's the spikiness is important.
I simulated at a 30-second resolution for several years. So that's not the issue. It's because it's easier, especially if you interconnect to other countries, and how Europe is already interconnected, then it's even easier. So we've looked at the UK in isolation or interconnected.
Yeah, but
gentlemen, we're coming off message here. I'm going to ask that we move on. And I'm going to go to Andy Johnson. You've got a question on faster bang for buck. Is that right?
I do. I think it's probably related to some of the conversation that's just been going on. In a world that I think has been quite eloquently argued by some of the speakers, that says actually we're short of renewables. We can't go fast enough to generate renewables which can reduce the demand for fossil fuels. In that kind of world where we're constrained, then surely there is a faster route to get the best return by pursuing the deployment of renewables to do that offset, rather than taking it into less efficient routes, trying to capture carbon. And I think that's exactly what Mark was just arguing. So, you know, if it was your 1 megawatt hour of energy available to you, generated by renewables, would you put it into turning off a gas plant, or would you put it into running a CCS plant?
You already know my answer, so I'll skip.
I think we retreat to established positions. But I think it's more complicated than that. So Mark again took as his baseline coal-powered electricity, which I think we all can recognize and we can come to an agreement on that that's a really bad place to be, having coal-powered electricity, which is unabated. The UK has gone through that. We've now got maybe 30% renewable electricity, which still has a resource cost, remember, because you've got to make the magnets and get the rare earths, and you've got to get all the metal work from somewhere. And so there is now a critical metals and rare earths boom going on where nobody's clear on how they're going to resource all this transition. Anyway, so you can build renewable energy, but we're still dependent largely on gas. And it's, again, you could shut all that off tomorrow if you wanted, but it will take at the present anything like the present rate of progress, which relies a lot on planning permissions and social permissions. It's not a technical problem. It will take 15 or 20 years to replace all that methane gas with renewable electricity. So I'm a big fan of replacing all that with renewable electricity, but we've got to get there somehow and stay alive in the process.
Okay, let's move on. I'm going to call on Amanda. I'm assuming you wanted to ask a question, but you didn't put an asterisk in. You had a question around the business case for carbon capture. Still with us?
Hi, yeah, I'm here. So in Alberta, in Canada, that's where I'm calling in from. I've worked out at Shell Scotford's carbon capture facility, Quest. And ultimately, at one point, it was no longer economically feasible for them to continue without government spending. And the government spent, I think, between $2 and $1.5 billion supporting this initiative. So maybe pulling it back to that idea of the social cost, but how do we push industry forward, either in terms of transition to clean energy or storage options when we don't have that government support, either through grant spending or through a carbon tax regime? So specifically with the Quest business case, one of the issues was when we transitioned to an output-based carbon tax regime in Alberta, energy efficiency credits, so any credits earned from the Quest, were no longer redeemable by Shell Scotford. So again, it just devalued the business case for the carbon capture storage. So how do we balance industry moving ahead in terms of no longer having the license to pollute while keeping fiduciary duty to stakeholders and shareholders and having that kind of partnership with government?
Well, if I can just jump in there. In the Norwegian sector of the North Sea, there is a large effort to decarbonize oil production. Now, this is maybe not what you want to hear. But the reason that's been undertaken is the fact that any emissions are paid for per ton of carbon. And not only is there a Norwegian carbon tax, but it's on top of the traded European carbon tax. And it's about $70 a ton of CO2. And that's enough to get people to decarbonize that particular activity. So that sort of level actually becomes an incentive to people to decarbonize their activities.
So that's what the oil industry globally has always said it wants. It wants a large carbon tax. And undoubtedly, and the Norwegians are talking about putting their carbon tax up to $200 a ton. And that's great if you've got the money. But if you put carbon tax across the whole economy, then that pushes up the price of everything for everybody. And so when the social sciences people have looked at it, they come up with lots of objections why that's socially unjust. So it may get you to a carbon objective, but it doesn't necessarily get you to an equal society objective. But it's a way of making progress, and making progress is good. On the Quest project, I'm not sure I completely understood your question, because I thought because it's a first project, it had been subsidized probably by the state government and probably by the federal government to some extent. But I thought the subsidies were much less than that, and Shell had actually gone and put quite a lot of its own money in. In terms of claiming the the credits of carbon stored, then that seems, if the government, either the state or the federal government has changed the rules so they can't get credit, then that's a pretty crazy type of action to do. So, but I don't know the details on that. I couldn't quite understand the question enough. But surely, if Shell can be building equipment which is internally powered off its own resources, which captures the carbon products from that and put the carbon back underground for permanent storage, and include that in the cost of the product, then that's what should be happening. Because the basic problem is we're not paying enough in any of the carbon products for what we
didn't understand the question. Can we ask Amanda to clarify that, please?
I think, you know, like our output-based carbon tax system changed. So it was for large emitters, it's no longer it's like a site-specific baseline. So really what the issue is that Shell Scotford does not have a business case to continue Quest. It is costing them hundreds of millions of dollars a year to continue running this facility. And they're not getting a tax incentive currently with our carbon tax regime structure under our conservative provincial government. So my question is, where is the lever for industry to continue to look at innovations and ways to make their industry cleaner, either through hydrogen or even carbon capture, when there's no business case? So how do we bring forward that social cost to show that, you know, ESG and sustainability and reputational risk and ultimately first movers is driving this change when the economic business case is no longer there? And that's what's happened in Alberta.
Right. So my answer to that is what I very briefly explained at the end of my presentation, that the economic system by which we do not include the emissions cost or the damage cost of the carbon is a crazy system. So we're all complicit in buying carbon, diesel or gas or coal or oil too cheaply because nobody pays to clean up. Whereas I'm proposing what we should be doing, which is an easy change, is including the mandate, the enforcement on the producers of the fossil carbon, that they have to clean up the carbon dioxide emissions as part of the deal. So in United Nations terms, they're obligated to clean up the scope 3 emissions, the full consequences of the use of their product. And so that then would mean that Shell, for example, would carry on storing in the Quest site. They would pay for that, but they would include the cost of that in the wholesale price of the fuels which come out of that refinery. So the users of those wholesale fuels would have to pay more, and of course that cost would eventually get transmitted through to us. But because the actual energy cost of most things we purchase and use, the energy cost is only a few percent, that's only going to have a small impact on us as consumers. But embedding the cost back with the producer, the cost of cleanup back with the producer, is the fundamental change I think we need to do, because we have let all those producers of fossil carbon escape liability ever since the 1700s.
So then, Stuart, then ultimately it's really up to financial institutions and the bankers, because at this point, from a global perspective, other than some integrations with IIRC, we're not disclosing contaminated sites and environmental liabilities on our balance sheet, right? So the idea that I'm going ahead and I'm going to continue the business case of carbon capture storage with the idea that I have a liability, but that liability is not represented on my actual financial statements, and it's not considered in my cost of capital, and it's not considered in terms of my disclosures and my ratios. So what you're proposing works in theory, but if on the finance side and the banking side and the financial institution side, if we're not even looking at contaminated sites or asset retirement obligations, then again, you're just you're asking an industry that's never been responsible to be responsible?
So I'll reply to that in two ways. So yes, I am asking them to be responsible, but then if they're not going to be responsible voluntarily, which is difficult for them to do that voluntarily because it's always the last person to move is the dirty person. If they won't do that voluntarily, the job of government is to govern. So the government of any individual company, any individual country, sorry, any individual jurisdiction can place that obligation on those companies producing or bringing in carbon into that jurisdiction. So we could do that in the UK to say that anybody producing oil, gas from the North Sea or bringing in oil, gas or coal from outside the UK has to be liable to store the same amount of carbon as they've brought in. Also, so that's one simple rule change which should have a really fundamental and powerful effect. And so you would expect all the fossil fuel producers to resist that tooth and nail. But nonetheless, I think that puts the obligation where it belongs on the producers of the product. And the second way I'll answer your question is I think certainly in the London stock markets and a lot of conversations you see with the Bloomberg and maybe New York stock markets, then that carbon disclosure or that climate risk disclosure is now being adopted by most large companies. So certainly the top 100 or 200 companies are doing that, again, voluntarily, but it's now being expected by their boards of directors and activist shareholders to disclose that climate risk and what they're doing about it.
And that could also be made a mandatory thing if you listed on any one of the major stock markets in the world. So it had to go on your balance sheet.
Do you have a comment on this, Mark?
No, well, yeah, I'm going to pass for now, but go ahead.
Okay, we'll move on. Thank you for that heated discussion, Amanda, thank you. We're going to move to Noel, but he's asked me to ask the question on his behalf. So, and this is particularly for Stuart to begin with, how can the carbon capture and storage technologies be feasible and viable to the major developing economies, for example, South Asia, India, and the countries of Africa?
So it's a great question. And I think that's, again, really fundamentally goes to the, if you like, the greed and self-interest of a lot of Western economies. Because in Paris Agreement in 2015, the Western economies pledged to put something like it's 100 billion of some currency, and I think it was 100 billion a year into assisting emerging economies to mitigate climate problems and to decarbonize, and that money's not been paid across. So it's really difficult to imagine countries who are struggling to feed people and keep them alive investing in luxury items like burning a bit more coal to have cleaner coal. You know, that's a hard thing to imagine. So I think all our governments are culpable in not doing that. And the second part to my answer to that is that I think it's becoming apparent that onshore wind power and onshore solar photovoltaic power for generating electricity is now less cost to install from scratch than even building an unabated coal plant or a gas plant. So we in the West need to be stopping export subsidies, which is gradually happening. We used to subsidize other countries to build coal plants, for our people to build coal plants in their countries, even though we weren't building coal plants in our country. So we were subsidizing bad things happening elsewhere around the world. And the stock market police have eventually caught up with that, if you like, and that's now being phased out. So we need to actually pay over the money and help those less developed economies to go straight for straight for renewable power, not nuclear power, straight for renewable power and jump over the carbon power which we've been diverted for.
Stuart, the question was CCS technologies, not renewables.
But my answer is don't do CCS because don't build carbon plants.
Okay. Right, that was our last question. Thank you very much to our three speakers. You've put up with quite a lot tonight. We were expecting heated debate, and that's exactly what we got. So thank you very much for sticking with us. And I'm now going to hand back to Alison for final remarks.
Yeah, we actually have like 8 minutes left, so we possibly could do another question. And I'm not sure if there's one from the iPhone on the thing. I'm not sure if it's a question or not. Was that a question?
Let me come back to that on, wait a minute. It's not from a person called iPhone.
I know.
Yep, we did have a discussion, and where are we? So it was actually Robin from National Grid. And if Robin's still with us, he can ask his question. Has he copped out?
Possible.
Yeah.
Okay, so I just say that there have been a few of the publications of Mark's that he was talking about earlier put onto the chat. So if people want to have a look at that, then that shows the modelling that Mark has done. So that could be quite interesting for future reference and looking at, and bedtime reading, for instance, maybe. So anyway, thank you to all our speakers and to our audience. It's been really much more contested than it normally is, but that is to be expected when you talk about CCS. It is all to do, everything that we're talking about to get to net zero is about political will. Unfortunately, where you have businesses and industries with lots and lots of money, and then you have the people on the other side who are trying to make change in a different way, there's a bit of an imbalance somewhere that goes, and we're looking and we're seeing that right here in the northeast of Scotland right now when it comes to things and issues around the energy transition zone, for instance. So I think that our role as citizens is to be informed through events like this, but also then to speak to our representatives and put our views forward. But thank you so much for coming, guys. And thank you again to everybody who took part. And our next month's one is on biogas. So come along and be informed more about that.
Can we do a clap, Alison?
Yes, we can do a clap. Everyone can unmute and give a bit of a woo.
Hey, whoa, well done, everybody. Hey, well done.
Well done, guys.
It's always good to have visitors across the pond. So thank you for all coming.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you so much.
Cheers.
Yeah, cheers, Mark.
Thanks for inviting us. It was good debate.
Yeah, nice talking.
No,